Today's readings are from the book of Isaiah. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together, they come to you. Your sons shall come from afar away, and your daughters shall be carried in their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall be thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of nations shall come to you. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord. I will appoint peace as your overseer, and the righteousness as your taskmaster. Violence shall no more be heard in your land. Devastation or destruction within your borders. You shall call your walls salvation, and your gates praise. The sun shall no longer be your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give light to you by night. But the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. Here ends the reading.
As we know, this is the second Sunday in Advent, and I like the church seasons because they focus our attention on certain facets of our faith story. And Advent, as you know, has typically been framed as a season of waiting. And in fact, last Sunday, that's what I preached on. I preached about how we're invited to prepare and to wait for something good and beautiful and new to happen. It invites us to wait, to look upon the horizon for a new light to shine in our lives. And yet I suspect most of us yearn and our hearts ache for a God who might intervene, who would stop the madness and the hate and the violence. If only God functioned that way. Maybe not. Ultimately, though, during Advent, we wait for the arrival of God. Writer J.K. Smith, he runs the Image Journal, says, "This year I'm particularly struck by how bad we are waiting for God. This is not simply because of impatience, though that is certainly true. It is also maybe more so because we simply seem to lack the capacity to recognize God's arrival. God never shows up like we would expect." And as the season of Advent reminds us of the importance of expectant waiting, it also asks us to wake up, pay attention to the reality that God has already arrived. In fact, God keeps arriving again and again and again. But so often we're asleep or distracted that we miss God's arrival. Kenneth Stephen wrote a poem called Nativity, and I'm going to read it slowly and just invite you to just imagine the scene. When the miracle happened, It was not with bright light or fire, but a farm door with the thick smell of sheep and a wind tugging at the shutters. There was no sign the world had changed forever or that God had taken place. Just a child crying softly in a corner, and the door open for all who would come to find. Who could imagine on that day, how many centuries ago, that God had arrived in the world? Now, of course, God has always been around. Certainly, every religion testifies to a transcendent and inner experience of the sacred. Our own tradition testifies to a multitude of manifestations of God: the creator God, the judging God, the God of the burning bush. But in the nativity story, in the incarnation, we receive a new image of God, a vivid, real, tangible, personal God. A God that not only called forth all of creation, but a God who needs tending, a God who is vulnerable, a God with purpose and intentionality. Same old God, but a new revelation. Same God, but a new approach to the human condition, and don't we need that? Same time, same God, but this time has come into the world, subject to our own pain, who feels pain, suffering, joy, loss, just like we do. And as much as we see Advent as a time of waiting, it is also a time of awakening, of looking for the open door, of listening for the crying infant, of adopting a new attitude of expectation for the God who is here now. What I love about Advent is that we return to the place of God's arrival, and we are invited once again to be amazed, to connect, to care, to see what God is doing now. J.K. Smith writes, "We look for God in the extraordinary, and God arrives incarnate in the mundane, even abject, hidden right before our eyes." But we miss it. And what if the arrival has happened and we're not only still waiting, but it's happened, but we don't recognize it? Maybe what we're waiting for is not the arrival, but the healing of our attention, so we might see where God has already taken place. Martin Laird is a contemplative who wrote a book called Silent Land. And he says this: because God is the ground of our being, the relationship between creature and creator is such that by sheer grace, separation is not possible. God does not know how to be absent. And the fact that most of us experience throughout most of our lives a sense of absence or distance from God is the great illusion that we are caught up in. It's our human condition. And Laird talks about what he calls the awaring self. And he says what is needed is a change in me, in each of us. Advent asks us not only to wait, but to become aware and awake to the God that is already there. The challenge is that we really are required to slow down, to pay attention, to listen. And of course, ironically, we're at the time of the year where our senses are probably most stimulated by sounds and events and demands and decorating and eating and buying. It's hard to stay awake and aware to the God that is already here, who's arrived. Are you attentive to the God that has already arrived? Tracy Lind is an Episcopalian minister, and she recounts meeting God at a McDonald's at 5 p.m. on January 31st in 1984 in New York City. Tracy was entering her second semester of seminary at the time, and she was wrestling with many issues in her life, both vocationally and personally. Tracy had grown up in a Jewish and Protestant household, and she could not discern her own religious identity. Now, she'd had many one-way conversations with God, but this one was different. And so she's walking along the street and she says, "Let me go and let me get on with my life." And that's when it happened, she recounts. As I was crossing Madison Avenue, a voice called out to me from within inside of me and said, "I'm not going to let go of you." And she thought, well, what do you want with me? And the voice said, "Your life." She says, well, at the moment I realized that something was going on that I better pay attention. So I did what anyone else would do. I walked into the nearest McDonald's. I ordered a cheeseburger, French fries, and a small Coke. I sat down at the table and I started writing out the most remarkable and memorable conversation that I've ever had with anybody my entire life. For the next 30 minutes, she reports that the voice called her by name, identified itself as God, confronted her with her issues and her wounds, contradicted her newly acquired seminary theology, answered her questions. And in the course of the conversation, she said, "So why are you talking to me?" And the voice responded, "Well, you've been asking for it." Are you asking for it? She said, "I had been asking and begging and praying and even challenging God to get clear with me, to give me some direction. And so here I was sitting at McDonald's in the middle of New York City on a winter afternoon, having a private conversation with an invisible voice." At the end of their time together, she said, "Okay, so if you're inside of me, then how can you be God?" And the voice replied in words, she says, that I will never forget. "What's so special about me is that I'm inside of each and every person. And if everyone would hear my voice and follow it, then my realm on earth would come." Now, Tracy didn't know if she was really talking to God, but she knew if there was a God, she wasn't going to get a clearer message than that. So she decided to receive it and accept it as a gift. And over the next 30 years of ministry, it gave her courage to live and work in some really tough neighborhoods and communities. It gave her the conviction to stand up for justice along in society, those who are rejected. It called her to embrace the complexity of religious diversity. Talking with God called her to embrace so much more. Tracy, some may call it the voice of an angel. Some call it an inner wisdom. Some call it a higher power. Some call it a figment of her imagination. But it radically changed her life. Tracy advises, if you want to hear the voice, there are 4 things to do. Ask. Are you asking? Do you have a conversation? Do you ask? And then you have to wait. Are you patient? Are you waiting? And then, this is really important, are you listening? It's hard to listen. And then finally, receive. Are you willing to receive the answers that you get? This Advent reminds us, offers us, beckons us to ask, to wait, to look, to expect, to receive the God who has arrived and keeps on arriving. It shows us a God who has arrived as a tiny, precious, vulnerable human being. And it offers humankind a new chance, a new perspective, a new saving grace, another way to understand this immense vastness that supports us and loves us. And I'm going to just repeat that last little portion of that poem. There was no sign that the world had changed forever or that God had taken place. Just a child crying softly in a corner. The door open for those who came to find. This Advent, may each of us stay awake, alert, and journey to the door that is open for us. Amen.